This is kind of some important stuff. This is the granddaddy of them all in terms of macro, I think, in terms of the macroeconomic models. Again, it's bringing together all of our pieces with our flows with the rest of the world, the financial sector, which I'm actually on the wrong one, the financial sector, consumption, investment, government spending. We're bringing all various things together here in this chapter. And so the remainder of the course will end up using this model specifically to make predictions on different policies. So that's why this one's important. So we left off last time introducing the aggregate demand curve. But we just kind of started into it. The aggregate demand curve. And it kind of makes sense intuitively from what we saw in micro class, where we had maybe a downward sloping demand curve for cotton or a downward sloping demand curve for beer or pizza. As the price falls, people buy more. And so that intuition is pretty solid. However, the timing, there's a few other issues since we're dealing with the aggregate demand. So I don't think we defined this last time, did we? Or did I give you a full definition? Did I write it all out? I just put players, yeah. So today I'm going to define this a little more fully. The aggregate demand. So this function shows the amount of final goods and services demanded by society at various price levels. At various price levels. It is downward sloping by virtue of two effects. By virtue of, one, a wealth effect. And I think I maybe mentioned these, but I didn't write it down. A wealth effect is one reason it's downward sloping. And all I'm trying to explain, for the most part, is a movement from strategically put this a little bit differently, a little more in the center. A movement from, let's say, A to B. If the price level falls from 120 to 110, that is going to increase our wealth, our real wealth. So a decrease in the price level leads to an increase in our real wealth. And by real wealth, we always kind of think back to purchasing power. So real wealth is the purchasing power of your wealth. I think the easiest thing from a micro concept to think about with wealth is your house. We talked about that before during the financial crisis. That had an impact on normal mom and pops around the United States. They were getting wealthier because real estate prices were going up. So the amount of wealth that you have from your house is the house value. So if you have a $150,000 house and you only have a $100,000 debt with the bank, you've got $50,000 worth of equity in your home. And equity is a contributor then to your overall wealth. Now, you can't run to Walmart with equity and buy stuff off the shelves, right? So you'd have to ultimately sell it and then you'd be able to do it. Well, that's kind of the whole concept here, is that if the price level's going down, the purchasing power of that savings, of that equity, goes up. You can buy more things as prices tend to fall over time. Sometimes it might be easier to just flip the arrows the other way, and that's always true unless otherwise noted in this class. If I have an up arrow and it leads to a down arrow, then a down arrow leads to an up arrow, right? So we're always talking about whether variables such as wealth and real wealth and price level are positively related or negatively related. Positive relationship, one goes up, the other goes up. One goes down, the other goes down. That's a positive relationship. Negative, one goes up, the other goes down, or one goes down, the other goes up. Negative and positive relationships. So if we flip the arrows here, an increase in the price level is inflation, leads to a decrease in real wealth. Maybe that one's a little bit easier to think about, but it works in both directions. Okay, so all of that leads us to having greater purchases going on with this wealth effect. B would be a couple substitution effects. So we've got substitution effects. And there's kind of two cases. One type of substitution effect that I think we mentioned before was an intertemporal substitution. Intertemporal. What did that mean? I think we tried to squeeze this out of you before. Anybody want to venture guess? Temporal time, right? Over time. Future versus today. So households can substitute possibly future consumption and current consumption. You guys are doing that. Those of you who are going into debt, you know that you are obligated to pay back that debt. Some people kind of forget that part, right? So you can substitute consumption today by borrowing from tomorrow, right? So you borrow, you can increase your consumption today by taking away consumption from the future, because you'll have to pay back that debt in the next time period, which allows you to consume less that time frame because you're paying back your creditor. So that is a temporal substitution of consumption. Okay, so back to linking it back to the price level then. If there's inflation and prices are going up, we learn that there's a connection there with interest rates. So nominal interest rates are going to go up. We learned from previous chapters in the financing. We saw that with the Fisher formula, the relationship between the real rate and inflation rate and the nominal rates. So an increase in the price level leads to an increase in the interest rates, leading to an increase in saving. But an increase in savings today means that consumption is falling. So an increase in savings, which is, I want to put in parentheses, a decrease in consumption.
Also borrowing, right?
What's that?
As interest rates go up, borrowing goes down.
Right, but here we're looking at their behavior over time. So that's pushing up time, increasing savings. So if we were looking at the savings supply curve, it'd be moving up along the savings supply curve. So increase in savings, decrease in consumption, C plus I plus G plus X equals GDP. I'm ultimately getting back to our variable here, or a decrease in real GDP. All I'm kind of working through is the chain of events that would allow us to make this argument that if there was an increase in the price level, we would have less being consumed and therefore less real GDP. Substituting over time. Foreigners are going to have effect too. So if we look at the rest of the world, we have an international substitution going on with international prices. A decrease in the price level makes American goods look more attractive relative to Chinese goods, assuming they're being held constant. So a decrease in the price level makes U.S. goods more attractive than row goods, the rest of the world's goods. Does that lead to an increase in U.S. exports or a decrease? An increase. So that leads to an increase in exports, which is an increase in net exports. This is our X from cigarettes again, which leads to an increase in real GDP, or Y. I've been kind of writing these back and forth just to get you comfortable with swapping half Y and real GDP. Okay, so those are just some reasons why we'd see this relationship. I think our gut feeling overall, prices fall, we want to buy more, but there's other things going on, and that's why it's a little more complicated looking at the wealth effect and the rest of the world. Before I forget, Kyle, after class, don't forget to post hours. Okay? And then we'll talk about it after class. But all right, shifters. Things get a little more interesting when we bring in shifters. In fact, this is where really most of the story comes to us for the chapter. All right. In fact, let's redraw this. You guys start fresh. I just don't want to be bothered by that A to B. Let's leave that as a one thought. And now let's just redraw all three graphs. And when you do it, for starters, I just want you to intersect all of them at the same spot. Couple key things to this graph that we talked about last time. What's this? The potential. So this was the potential amount of output. So thinking back to the production possibilities, what does the L stand for? Long run. So in the long run, what would the supply of goods and services look like? And we're saying, hey, over the long haul, we can only do so much. We can only produce so much. That is our potential level of output. We're going to be somewhere. We could dream of being here, but we can't be there. There's real constraints on the economy given our resource base. We got a certain bucket of resources, and we can only do what we can do. So that's an important anchoring spot. So as we think about the shifters, you can see where this is going to bring us. If I call this PL1, and I'll use this a lot just to keep kind of some math concepts a little more simple. I'm just going to assume that the price level is at 100. It could be 97, it could be 110, it could be 214. It is what it is, but I'm just going to arbitrarily start us off at 100. And so the fun's going to happen when things change. And that's where these shifters come into play. And certain things are going to cause economic growth in the form of real GDP, and may as well also cause increases in the price level, which is ultimately inflation. So that kind of sets the stage for these aggregate demand shifters. Last time, I tried to make a connection for you between the players. And so I think one of the last things I left you with was to think about the demand having its four components like we were used to looking at with the expenditure approach to measuring real GDP. With the expenditure approach, we're simply categorizing consumers and households here, investment by businesses in capital, machinery, and equipment, government purchases of weapons of mass destruction and other things, toilet paper for the White House, and net exports, the difference between what we sell to the rest of the world and what they buy from us. Okay, because that then sets up the shifters. So shifter number one comes to us via the consumption route. Now, the shifter is really consumption through taxes. Changing tax rates, which if you just about listen to any news on the economy, just about any day of the week, you'll probably catch something on the battle going on. Republicans think we should drop tax rates. Democrats think we should raise them or keep them constant. And then it's this battle of, what are we talking about, G or T? Well, G and T are both fiscal policy instruments. So fiscal policy in general is government changes to G and or T. So when we talk about T, we've got a big T and a little t. Tax revenue collected, so kind of like the total tax revenue collected, comes to us from an income tax of little t times our gross income. We did this equation before, back in, I don't remember, a while back. And we're going to keep working on it the rest of the semester, so that's why a little repetition here, bringing back. So from a formula standpoint, the amount of tax revenue that the government collects from income is simply a tax rate times the amount of income. Is everybody clear on that? Okay, so the fiscal policy change here can be a change in the tax rate. So double recall number 2, recall 2, was disposable income. What was disposable income? How would you word that? Let me see who's alive in the back half of the room here. Disposable income. Let's take a stab. Eric, give me a number between 5 and 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Riley, what do you got for disposable income?
I don't know, extra money or like extra income that you have left over that you can spend on anything.
Okay, good. Leftover after what? Somebody add some words in for Riley. You're right. It's disposable, so it's like it's left over from something left after taxes, right? So disposable income was income after taxes. So the equation that we could use for this is simply my gross income minus my taxes that I got to pay for the government, which was based off of my gross income. So, in other words, that could look like this: y minus big T, income after taxes. I want to sneak in one other little innovation from this formula. Algebra people, what can I do with this sucker when I got a y here minus a ty? Factor out that y, right? So I can re-express this. I'm going to put the y at the end, but right? Legitimate? 1 minus t equals, or times y gives me my disposable income too. Now let's just throw in some percentages. If the taxes were 20%, I get to keep 80%, right? So it flows pretty nicely for us. So it's just like 1 minus 0.2 equals 0.8, which is really 80%. 80% of my money is my take-home pay that I get to go spend on whatever I want, right? So disposable income. All right, well, what did I spend my disposable income on? Consumption or savings. So we're going to separate my disposable income into consumption and savings. We're going to ignore the rest of the world. I could be, it's kind of combined into here. I mean, I could be consuming foreign goods or American goods, but we got consumption plus savings. All right, so those are some important formulas now to keep in the back of my mind. I'd say even just memorize them for the next test, and memorize them now so that when we get into a few more models in the upcoming chapters, you kind of have those right off the tip of your tongue. So this ends up changing our demand for goods and services through consumption, because if the government collects more money, if they raise tax rates, then I'm going to reduce my consumption. So that's going to cause me to have less disposable income, and I'm going to reduce consumption. By the way, I'm also going to reduce savings. I'm going to reduce them both if I'm doing some fraction. If I tend to spend 90% of my money and save 10% of my money, if I have less money, I'm going to do less of both, right? So that's our shifter. So let me write that out. I'm kind of running out of board there, so let me, I guess I can go right here. So let's go through the logic we just did. An increase in little t, an increase in the tax rate, leads to a decrease in consumption, which now is going to manifest itself in this model as a shift of the aggregate demand curve. So a decrease in consumption is going to lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. And that is a shift to the left of aggregate demand. Now that's where using this little helper up here comes in handy. A decrease in consumption, what happens for my shifter? Well, if this is going down, this is going down, right? So I kind of use that equation as a reminder of which direction the aggregate demand curve is shifting. So if that was the only thing going on in the economy, real GDP going to go up or down? Down. Price level up or down? Down. So we go this way with it. Now, are there any long-run effects to that? Are there any long-run effects to that? Using this model, using just the curves that are up here, no. So now we're going to start to set the stage for some short-run effects and long-run effects on how things are going to adjust. Whatever the tax rates are, they're going to be, and we'll get into more complex ways to analyze that in future chapters. But for now, it's a shift to the left, and it's going to lead to a short-run decrease in output and the price level. Okay, there's number one. Number two. We've got investment is next on our cigarette list. The key variable that we have for investment is profit expectations. Profit expectations, of course, if we're talking about profits, we're talking about profit expectations by business. Remember, we set the stage that businesses are the ones that are doing the majority of borrowing. So when we developed the loanable funds market, the demand for loanable funds was primarily businesses. They were the ones that kind of were the lion's share of the demander for loanable funds. When the government entered that market and drove interest rates up, that crowded out some of the private businesses. So we had that dynamic going on. But that's our businesses, and they're highly dependent upon profit expectations. Okay. So an increase in profit expectations. So in other words, the Wall Street Journal and business people around are just thinking, you know, I think 2013 is going to be a really good year. And they're just kind of thinking optimistically about the future. How does that affect their behavior today? Do they tend to increase I or decrease it? Increase, right? So they're going to tend to increase purchases of capital and equipment and inventory and all those things that come along with preparing for a good year. They're going to increase that, which then is an increase in aggregate demand. A shift to the right. Okay, so I'm just going to add as another note here on interest rates. We talked about that over here. An increase in interest rates leads to a decrease in investment. That was the crowding out effect, which of course would be a decrease in aggregate demand all by itself. Okay, number 3 is G, government spending. That's the G that I mentioned up here, and I kind of reluctantly put it up here, but I hope you see that we're defining what fiscal policy is here. That's not one of the shifters up here. It's a shifter down here. We're treating it separately. So you might note that this is the G of fiscal policy. So fiscal policy of a change in government spending. We're going to buy more weapons. We're going to change some programs around. Whatever it is, we're changing fiscal policy. And increase in government spending leads to an increase in aggregate demand. Again, just following our formula, which is helpful to come back to. It seems pretty easy. Increase in G increases aggregate demand. So we can kind of go back to that each time with these. Our last one is the rest of the world. So for the rest of the world, number 4, we've got net exports. From our cigarettes, it's always been X. Don't forget that the single big X here is equal to exports minus imports. What we sell to the rest of the world versus what we buy from the rest of the world. Net exports. Okay, so the shifter here comes about in a couple different ways. So we've got, let's call it shifter number 1. If there's an increase in foreigners' income, so they're experiencing economic growth. China's probably a prime example. Although there's a few question marks out on China now, but China's been experiencing real economic growth. So when foreigners, we use the star again for the foreign country, when real GDP for the rest of the world is tending to grow, what's the effect on our market? They're going to buy more from us. They're going to increase exports, right? Now these are U.S. exports. They're buying more stuff from us. So an increase in income from foreigners leads to an increase in our exports, which is really an increase in big X, which is an increase in aggregate demand for the United States, for the domestic country. What happens if the foreigners are experiencing inflation relative to us? So if the foreign price level is going up, are they going to tend to buy more or less American goods? More. So same chain of events here could cause aggregate demand to increase for the Americans if the foreign price level is going up. As I stated at the beginning, all of these arrows can be flipped the other way. A decrease in this leads to an increase in the other. Or in this case, they're both positively related. Okay. So now we've got the beginnings of an economic model to tell stories about the 3 biggies. I haven't brought up the 3 biggies for a while, but what are the 3 things that we hope policymakers are keeping in mind as they look at various policies? Three policy goals. Big, broad, wide-reaching policy goals. What were those? Okay, those were the things, real GDP, inflation, and unemployment. And then let's add a little bit more detail. What about real GDP? What do we want happening? up. So increase real GDP, which is how we defined economic growth. What about inflation? Low and stable. So we don't want that one necessarily going up. We don't want to get into hyperinflation or other problems. So an increase in, oops, I put the word increase just because it was on my brain. Low and stable inflation. The Federal Reserve is the one that is kind of top dog in that department as far as having discretionary power of how much inflation is, because we learned in Chapter 8 that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. At the end of the day, you just start flooding the market with dollar bills, and lo and behold, eventually prices will go up. There's a strong correlation between prices and the money supply. Last one. Unemployment. 0? No. Natural rate would probably be ideal. But in general, let's just say low unemployment. And then maybe we'll put in parentheses here the natural rate. The reason I wanted to not just say the natural rate is that you ask 100 economists and you're likely to get 100 different answers on what the natural rate is. We don't really know that. It's kind of hard. We kind of think it's probably between 5 and 6%, but you'll get some economists saying it's 4.5%. So there is some question mark about that. But some sort of unemployment is not only not bad, but it's desirable. We want to have some unemployment because it's the sign of a healthy economy, that we've got some normal job market turnover. Okay, speaking of job market turnover, don't forget that the career fair is going on today. A little side plug. You guys, if you want a job after you get done with it, maybe that doesn't apply to everybody, but if you're thinking about jobs, even if you're a freshman or a sophomore, go up there and look around. Start thinking about what's out there, who's out there, talk to some people, see what the groove is like. And get a feel for that. All right, so here's our policy goals that we hope to keep in mind. Let's walk through an example of an increase in government spending. That's been pretty popular the last 3 years, trying to pull ourselves out of recession. Let's walk through what happens with an increase in government spending. So, for example, suppose the government, I'm going to switch to, suppose decides to increase its purchases of bombs and locate them within striking distance of, give me a country, any country. North Korea, that's the one I was hoping to hear, because if you guys have been paying attention to the news, we very well might be taking North Korea out here pretty soon. I don't know, he's pretty wild. I just watched an interesting National Geographic documentary on North Korea, so if you guys got Netflix, it says Inside North Korea. Check that one out. It's pretty impressive of what's been going on. I didn't realize it was to that level of dictatorship. Very Nazi Germany-ish feel when you see what's currently going on in North Korea. Not different, but I mean that the whole propaganda thing and signs all over. So, all right. So let's say hypothetically North Korea. All right. So this is going on today. I mean, they just announced on the radio yesterday or the day before that we've set up we've kind of mobilized some areas to be within striking distance. Okay, so what happens here then in our graph? What are our predictions of that change in policy where we are choosing to increase weapons of mass destruction? What happens? What's shifting? What's moving? Aggregate demand is shifting left or right? Right. So we end up getting a shift to the right. And here's some notation that we'll use maybe to show this. We could put, well, let me first put 81 and 82, because that'll be pretty common. But to kind of help you motivate things, and as you look back and review for the test or homework, you might also say, you know, that this is because G1 has G2 ramped up its amount of weapons to some higher level. And I could put numbers, and you'll see homework problems where suppose the current government level of spending is 100 million on weapons, and now it's 150 million on weapons. And then we'd start to have numbers associated with that. Okay, so we started off at point A. The economy is going to move to point B in the short run. So output would expand out to Y2 if we call the potential here the first starting position. Inflation starts to get some upward pressure by the economy moving up to PL2. Let's just call this 105. So what is the rate of inflation? 5%. So new number minus the old number divided by the old number. 105 minus 100 divided by 100. That's why we use this number. Otherwise, just subtract the two, and it's going to be 5%. Now, all of that was predicated upon something, because the economy could be going to point C. Point C looks awfully tempting. So why did we not move to point C? And we're saying that we moved to point B. What was going on to have the economy move from point A to point B? It was something with supply.
Production.
Not with production. Flip, flip, flip back a couple pages. This is like the big deal of understanding this model well enough to pass this class. Well, probably well enough to pass the final. This is a biggie. I'm just trying to emphasize. What's going on along this short-run aggregate supply curve? And I'll ask my students who did not have me for money and banking. What's happening along that short-run aggregate supply curve? Because I made it a big deal to them already in the previous class. So hopefully they're grinning and ready to spew.
So to do with the lag on output and resource prices?
Resource prices, right? So that was one of the things that shifted it. I'm not sure exactly how you read that, but along a stationary short-run aggregate supply curve, we're going to hold resource prices fixed. That's a big deal. That means this: when there's 5% inflation, we're not going to give you a 5% pay raise, right? So what happens to the purchasing power of your paycheck? It goes down. You can't buy as much stuff as you used to. That's the big catch here. So I'm going to just kind of motivate that by saying, suppose you were currently earning $10 an hour nominal pay. You now have less purchasing power. You can't buy as much as you used to. Your $10 used to buy 10 bucks worth of stuff. Now it buys something less than 10 bucks worth of stuff because of the 5% pay raise. All right, so let's just say that the economy moves from A to B. North Korea's a bust. It turns out he was a coward after all, and we didn't have to bomb the heck out of him. So what happens from here now that there's this inflation in the economy? What do you guys do at your jobs? What do you tend to eventually say? You go to the store, you're not buying as much stuff, you want a raise. Yeah, you want to ask for a raise, right? If things aren't working, like you do the bottom line, you're running out of money each month, you start to have a request for pay. Maybe not everybody all at once, but we start to ask for pay raises. Once those pay raises kick in, what happens to the short-run aggregate supply curve? It shifts. Which direction? To the left. So as the pay raises kick in, we start to drift up towards C. And in fact, if we were able to get enough of a pay raise to shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to here, how much money are we making in nominal terms? We're making $10 before. How much additional money do I need to be making to be just as well off in terms of purchasing power? 5%. What's my nominal wage that works for that? $10 and a buck would be a 10% raise, right? 50 cents. So $10.50 now leaves you just as well off as you were at point A. So you're at point A and point B, we're back to a long-run equilibrium. Okay, so we'll leave it at that for now and pick up there later.